Right in front of me, I have the head off of a early 80s Ford 1.6 CVH. Four cylinder, it's a Hemi, single overhead cam, and the head is aluminum. So, if if your head gasket died, it doesn't have to be on one of these. On any engine that has a failed head gasket, something always causes the failed head gasket. It's very rare that the head gasket just dies on its own, unless your engine is old enough. The head gasket. Uh, a little bit of backstory. Lately, we've been starting to see head gaskets fail on a lot of our 70s and 80s Honda motorcycles. And it's not from machines that have been driving around a lot, it's from machines that have been sitting for a long time. I had just restored a 83 VF700, VF750 Honda Interceptor. And after I went through the hassle of painting the entire frame, ripping every single part off, painting those, putting it back on the frame, everything, got it running. It ran so good. It was a perfect machine. But after a little bit of driving, we saw some bubbles in the coolant reservoir, and that means only one thing: failed head gasket. So I get the pleasure of ripping it down to absolutely nothing again, starting back up from scratch, and replace the head gaskets, both of them, because it's a V4. But yeah, sadly, that's something we're starting to see on, like I said, all of our 70s and 80s motorcycles that have been sitting for a long time. The ones that have been running for the majority of their lives, they seem to be in good shape. So I'm not sure if it's just poorly mixed coolant that's causing it, or the fact that there is some sort of liquid in there, in the coolant passageways. Engines that are stored dry, I don't think there'll be an issue, but the thin metal plates that they use as head gaskets, they don't last forever. But these engines, the early ones, Ford typically just used a kind of fiber gasket, something you'd see like on lawnmowers, just cheap single cylinder, 4 strokes, whatever. But this one has in store a metal performance head gasket, so it'll be a lot thinner, pretty hardy. But that's not what we're here to talk about. We're here to talk about head gaskets, head warpage, why head gaskets fail. Well, typically why head gaskets fail, aside from age, like I mentioned, it's usually because at some point the motor gets so hot that either the head warps or the block warps, or both. It happens a lot. And any time that happens, whenever the head or the block warps, you will blow out your head gasket. It's guaranteed. You won't always know until you start seeing bubbles in your coolant, or you start seeing oil or coolant leaking down your block, or oil and coolant in the exhaust, or white smoke out the tailpipe, a lot of blue smoke, things like that. But if you catch it right away, you won't really see any of that. You'll see bubbling in your coolant. And if you were to take your head off, you should be able to see clearly where the head gasket had failed. You'll see dark spots, like around this area and here. You'll have big black stripes here between all the cylinders where the head's been warping, because it's where the most heat is. So the head will warp here, and here first before anywhere else. So when you take your head gasket off, on the head gasket you'll see black here, and here. Sometimes up in these triangles, sometimes in the lower triangles. Pretty common. And you also see those same exact black spots on the head gasket itself, from where exhaust and carbon in the exhaust has been passing past the head gasket. And being the head gasket is typically a fiber, like I said, it's pretty porous. It's always going to capture that carbon and hold it there. So what do we do once we take the head off the block? Well, it does you no good to put a new head gasket on, torque it down, and call her good. No. If it doesn't fail that afternoon, it'll fail in the next 2-3 months. Usually, your head is warped, or your block is warped, depending how hot your motor got, what metal your block is made out of. If it's aluminum, it's probably warped. If it's steel, less likely, but can still happen. Same with heads. With aluminum, it's pretty common that they warp under severe heat. When it's steel, it's still possible, just a little less likely. So, once you got your head off, the manual says that there is a way to check your head for warpage. And 9 times out of 10, this is exactly what they say. They say, take a straight edge, take a measurement here, take one here, take one here, take one last one, just like that. What you're supposed to do is when you're holding the straight edge up like this, you're supposed to take your feeler gauge, I have mine here, and if your head is aluminum, they typically say put we'll focus here, focus. Yeah, take your 6/1000ths of an inch feeler gauge and put it between your straight edge and your block or your head, wherever metal intersects with your straight edge. So when you put your straight edge here, you need to put your feeler here, and here, there, and all those same places throughout the rest of the block. Same story goes when you put it up here. You want to run the feeler all the way across, and you have it down below, all the way across. You also want to take it like this, all the way down, at this spot, all the way down. And again here, again there, and again right in here. So like I said, it does you no good putting on a warped head, or putting a fresh head gasket on if you have a warped head or warped block. It won't do you any bit of good. You'll just end up replacing it again. It'll be a never-ending cycle of replacing the head gasket. Which is typically why people sell cars, because you're just repeatedly replacing the head gasket, and they forget to fix the overheating problem, for one. For two, they don't check that the head or the block is warped. They're very easy things to check. They're very easy to overcome. I showed you the way the manual says. There is another way. What the manuals say with your straight edge is actually pretty handy for doing like the exhaust sides of motors, or the exhaust side of heads on 4 strokes. Probably not too essential on 2 strokes unless, well, the reason why they have you check this is because the exhaust side of an aluminum head of a 4-stroke will typically warp whenever it overheats. And that's because you can imagine all the hot air from the cylinder has to come out each of one of these exhaust ports. And when that happens, it gets pretty hot where the head meets the exhaust manifold, or the header, whatever you have. So I've seen before that exhaust manifolds that have gotten so hot they warp. So like I have an exhaust manifold off, well, this is one of the two. This is the header pipe for a Goldwing, a GL 1000. What happens is sometimes these plates will warp. And if you imagine something similar to this being on my head here, it can warp. It's not an inch thick of steel, and even if it was, it would just be holding more hot temperature. So they do eventually just warp. And the ruler test straight edge test is a good way to measure it. It's the same procedure. Put your feeler gauge in there. Anywhere there's metal touching metal, that's where you want to put your feeler gauge. get that sorted out. I haven't had too many of these with a warped exhaust mating surface, but it does happen. You even see the exhaust manifolds themselves warp. It happens. Headers seem less apt to do it, probably because they have more flow. They were probably allowing the hot air and exhaust to flow through them a whole lot faster and more efficiently, meaning there's less hot air in this whole area, which is good. But there is, like I said, another way to check the actual combustion chamber part of your head, what we call the deck mating surface. This is the deck that meets the top side of the block, of the top of each of the cylinders. So I'll rotate this down. Let's see how we do this here. So, right here I have a granite block. I think it's granite. Its construction doesn't really matter. Just know that it's stone, okay? And stone is pretty level as long as it's been machined level. And this was machine level. You can usually tell because they got like I'll move my head here. Typically have a glossy surface. You can see light reflecting off it. So that means that this has been ground flat, sanded, then polished. Now it's got a nice shine to it. On the back side of these, you'll typically see a machined side. You can see that's why it's really rough down there. That is not the side you want to use. And you want a block that's over an inch thick and one that's adequately big enough for the heads you're working on. You can see that mine's a little smaller. This is the one I use for motorcycle heads, small engine heads, everything but car heads. I have a big one that's a fair bit wider than my head elsewhere, but it's about 4 inches thick and it weighs a ton. I think it weighs like 80-90 pounds, somewhere in there. It's up there in weight. But that's what's ideal for this. I'm just showing you on my smaller one because it's more portable. I can bring it anywhere, not an issue. But what you do now is you set your head down on it. You grab your feeler gauge at your 6/1000ths. If it focuses, 6/1000ths. You want that. You take that and you just poke it against the cylinder head. And it should not go underneath. See, I'm poking it at my head and it's not going underneath. And then over here it goes under some, but because that's part of the casting. If you saw earlier, there's a couple holes like this in the casting. I believe that's for that's a no-go casting, part of the head. So when you take a head in to have it shaved, once this gap disappears, you can no longer shave it. But yep, you go all the way down. Your feeler gauge shouldn't go through. So far, hasn't yet. No problem. So good. So this head passed. At least it does on this block. If I had a longer block, I'm going to move this down some. I set it down like this, and now it's still good. But earlier I had this head up on a block and my feeler gauge was going right underneath it, but maybe I had a hunk of junk somewhere. Which is something you need to take care of and avoid when doing this. If you have any grit, all it takes is the tiniest bit of grit underneath your head or on your stone. Your feeler gauge will pass right through. And that's what happened with me earlier. So I rolled my head back. I cleaned it off. I cleaned off the block, put it back down. You can see I'm doing my test now. This head passes beautifully on this block. But I'm confident that on my big block it won't be a problem. And you do this all the way around. All the way around the head. Move my head over so we can show you what it's like on the ends here. See, it's trying to go under, but it can't. The only way it will go under is if I pick up the head. Oh, there we go. So we got a little warpage right there, but I'll flip the head over, I'll clean that, I'll set it back down, maybe it just disappears. When you do this test, you shouldn't have to be pushing down on it. If you're pushing down on it, you're cheating, right? You're not doing the warpage test any bit of good. You're just cheating to yourself. But that's more or less all there is to it. Sometimes these can get warped if you put down the wrong torque sequence or if you over torque them. But in a head this thick, it's not too often that happens. It's pretty hard to do. But it more or less covers all of the warpage tests. And if you can get yourself one of these blocks, I got this because I had seen that there's a headstone grinding company in town, and they had drove out into the middle of the woods and dumped a bunch of these just in the dirt. It was really weird. So I grabbed a couple stones. I got this guy who's pretty sizable, and then, like I said, I have a big one out back. And if your head does turn out to be warped, or like I said, you can do the same test with an engine block. If either are warped, what you can do is you can take your head off and you can put down, I believe it's either 600 or 800 grit for aluminum. So 600 or 800 grit sandpaper. You want a big swatch that's bigger than your head. Now, a head like this, it's awfully heavy. It doesn't like moving across sandpaper all that well, especially when it's warped. Because when it's warped, the two outsides typically sit down further, and the middle is poking up. So the two ends will dig down and rip up your paper. And finding a large enough swatch of paper is rather difficult. So if we pretended this was my new piece of paper, it's obviously not 600 or 800. You can use two of these guys, and whenever you put these down on your block, you'll want to tape around the outside as little as you can without this buckling, bowing, flopping around, anything like that. And when you're putting two side by side, don't tape the joint, don't tape above it, don't tape below it. You want to just butt up the pieces of paper as good as you can. As good as you can. And they should both be new pieces of paper every single time. And then you shouldn't have any issues. You just go back and forth in a oval, figure eight pattern. You know, you move your head around like that. Go get it down. Eventually, like I said, heads this big. They don't like moving around. So if yours is warped, seriously, like if you take your feeler gauge and you're passing like 3 thousandths under this thing, you'll want to take it into a shop and just have it ground. But if you're only passing like a 4 or 5 thousandths under this, you can probably fix that yourself. Like I said, just doing that figure eight pattern. I'm going to set my camera down one last time before we call it quits. We're going to take a peek at the head surface. You can see I had a little bit of debris on it again. It happens time to time, especially when you grab a random head, set it down somewhere. But yeah, that's pretty much all you need to look out for. You know, you'll typically warp here, and there. And with 4 cylinders, it's always going to be right in the middle. It's where the most amount of heat is because it can't escape. With air-cooled engines, you'll typically find that the outer two cylinders run a little bit leaner than the middle two, or the middle two run a little bit richer, however you wish to see it. But that's to keep the heat down in the middle two chambers. Same applies with straight fives, straight sixes, straight eights, everything of that nature. That's air-cooled, because there's always going to be heat right here. It's inevitable. But if you have a good thermostat, or the right thermostat, I mean, and you have a really good cooling system, you shouldn't have any issues. But be aware, if you're running way too lean, you will warp these heads. You will have valve problems. It doesn't really matter what engine you have. You know, they're all prone to something. But I think I went over everything I want to go over, so we'll leave it at that for now.